Hey guys, coming to you from Rome, Italy today. I just finished up a short tour with a great band that featured myself and Randy Brecker. We also played with this Italian trio that was led by a great pianist named Fabio Gacchino. Had a lot of fun, and I've been pretty much on tour nonstop over the past couple months, and I'm always kind of in and out of town, in and out of New York where I'm based. So I'm traveling a lot. Sometimes I take about 100 flights in a year. So a question that I get a lot because of that on my social media accounts, which I'm trying to answer some FAQs coming up here on YouTube. So if you have any questions, make sure to ask. But anyway, so a question that I get a lot because of all the traveling that I do is, how do you get your sax on board, or how do you get your instrument on a flight? And it's a great question, and I'm happy to help since I have a lot of experience in this. So we're going to go through 5 tricks for getting your instrument on board. And oh, real quick, I forgot to mention the new Chad LB and Sonic Magic album is out, so make sure to check that out if you haven't already. But anyway, so 5 tricks to getting your instrument on board. So 1, you want to be familiar with the airline policies. And if you're flying domestically, if domestic for you is in the US, if you're flying domestically, you want to be familiar with the FAA regulation on bringing on instruments. So what's awesome is in 2012, this new, something modernization act or something, I'll probably leave a link for it in the description below. This new, I think it's section 403, and it changed in 2012, so they made like an official policy that for domestic flights, all domestic airlines have to allow you to bring on your instrument. They say small instruments, so we'll talk about that in a second, but they have to let you bring on your instrument if it fits in the overhead space during the time that you board. They have to allow you to do that. So that's great. That's awesome. And sometimes airline, people working for airlines won't even know that. So you want to keep that documentation handy, even if it's just on your phone, anytime you board a plane domestically. Now, international flights, they don't have to adhere to that policy, so that's another thing. So you also want to be familiar with the airline regulations, though. And by the way, the small instrument, that wording is a little tricky. They say a small instrument like a violin or guitar. I think those are the examples that you give. So it's a saxophone, that's smaller than a guitar, you're fine. If it's a guitar, you're fine. Something like a cello, that gets into gray area. I've looked, out of curiosity, I've looked into this to see if there's anything more specific in the official documentation of what the FAA released, to see if there are measurements or anything that they give. It's really hard to find. I haven't been able to find anything on specific measurements. So, small, whatever that means, but you could say, oh, it's just a saxophone, or it's just whatever, and pull out that documentation, and they're pretty much going to have to let you on with the instrument. Now, with airline policies, that you want to be familiar with. Domestically, you just want to know how many things you can bring on board. You're not going to be able to bring a saxophone and a piece of luggage and a carry-on personal item, as they say. That's not going to work. So you want to be familiar with just the general rules. Then, okay, so for international flights, that gets into other stuff. You want to be familiar with the regulations of whatever flight that you're on. If somebody books you on Air Italy, for example, this is one that I just encountered. So Air Italy has a $260 fee for bringing on a musical instrument each way. Kind of crazy. So, if you're playing for a big festival or a big artist or something, they're going to reimburse you. It's fine. You want to confirm that ahead of time. That'll be fine. But if you're flying for a smaller gig, or you're flying on your own and you're just going somewhere and you want to take your instrument, that's going to be tough. So there's no way around it. They don't have to adhere to the FAA policies. This is an international flight. It's not a federal aviation thing. So that you can't really work around. Sometimes they don't enforce these things, but you just never know. So you want to probably follow the regulations. Then it's really important to know the regulations of each airline you're flying, because sometimes they don't know, like the people working for the airline don't know, and you can actually bring it on board just fine. Once I was flying, I believe it was China Airlines, and on this, because I have platinum status with Delta Airlines, It's another SkyTeam flight. They're affiliated. So I was flying with China Airlines. I'm going through the Sky Priority entrance and everything. I have elite platinum status or whatever they call it for the SkyTeam status. It's like the highest status that you can have. And still, I'm at the check-in counter and they tell me I can't bring my saxophone on board. However, I knew that my saxophone was within the measurements of their musical instrument policy, so I showed them. They were still giving me a hard time about it. I asked to speak to a supervisor. I'm showing them their policy. Eventually, they got the point that it's their policy and they have to let me bring it on board. But again, important to know the regulations. Another quick story on that, just to give you a sense of how strict they can be. Aeroflot, Russian Airlines, once I was flying first class on Aeroflot, and still, my saxophone, I didn't check the measurements properly. My saxophone was 2 centimeters too large as far as their regulation for bringing on an instrument. It was 2 centimeters too large, and I pretty much had to beg them to let me bring it on, which will bring us to a trick later on. So, okay, that was pretty long. That was step 1, but kind of need to get all that out. So now we're moving on to step 2, which kind of ties into what we were just talking about, the size of your instrument case. You want to get an instrument case that's meant for flying, So for me, I play Lupafaro saxophones, and the Lupafaro, I think they call it gig bag, is really great. It's just the standard case that you get when you get a Lupafaro. And it has a decent amount of storage space. It has the slot for you to put your neck in, and it fits on to all sorts of planes. So you want to make sure that whatever sax you get, if you're just flying domestically, you want to make sure that it's going to fit onto whatever plane you go on. Let's see, what are some of the smaller planes? I think it's like a CRJ 200 or something like that. You just look up what the smallest planes you'll fly on are domestically, figure out the measurements of the overhead bin space, make sure it fits. For me, the Lupafaro case fits in whatever I fly on, even if it's a really small plane. But sometimes that Lupafaro case is just a couple centimeters too large for something like Russia Airlines. So you want to have like a even smaller case potentially as a backup. I have a couple cases that I can take just to make sure that I'm always cool and within the measurements. So yeah, that's step 2. Make sure that you get a good case for flying. You also probably want to have it be a pretty hard case just in case the worst case scenario of it ends up under the plane. Okay, so step 3, you can just purchase priority boarding. Again, if you're on a domestic flight, there's the regulation that we talked about earlier in step 1. With a domestic flight, you are allowed to, and they have to let you put it in the overhead bin space if you board and there is space for the instrument. If you purchase priority boarding, you're going to be cool. Even with international flights, it can be helpful to get priority boarding just because if you're getting on first, they're less likely to give you a hard time bringing an instrument. Step 4 is a handy trick. So if you're about to get onto the jet bridge and you're about to board or you are boarding, you give them your boarding pass. Sometimes they'll see the instrument and they'll give you something. They'll say, "Oh, let me give you a tag for that." And so they want to tag the instrument, so when you get to the end of the jet bridge, you'll put it under the plane. It's probably a little safer than actually checking the instrument outright, like in the beginning of your process, back at the check-in counter. But still, this is something that can damage the instrument. What you want to do when they do this is just go along with it. Don't argue or anything. Just say, "Okay, thank you." When you start going down the jet bridge, when you're halfway down, go ahead and just take off that tag. Because it's not like they're calling down to the people on the airline or on the airplane saying like, "Oh, hey, we've got an instrument, make sure he doesn't bring it on board." So just take off the tag, put it in your back pocket. Once you get on the flight, just put it in the overhead space, you're fine. Another trick that you can do if you're flying with a band that kind of also relates to the tagging of your saxophone or your instrument. So if you're traveling with a band, when you go to the check-in counter in the beginning of the process, you can actually leave your saxophone with somebody else in the band. Don't have them check in yet. So if you're flying with a quartet or something, a couple guys will go check in. You're going to leave your saxophone back in just the general area where people can sit down and they're not checking in yet. Leave it back there, go to the check-in, get a tag that's for approved, not a tag that says you have to check the bag, but there are also tags that say for approved carry-on luggage. Get one of those for another piece of luggage. After you go through that check-in process, go back to your saxophone, put that tag on your saxophone instead, then go through security, and then at that point you've got a tag on your saxophone that says approved luggage. So then when you're boarding later on, they might see your instrument and say, oh, that's too big or something, but you're like, oh, I already have it approved, and then you're good. All right, cool. So that brings us to step 5. Step 5 is the last resort. Step 5 is to beg. So I talked about ain't too proud to beg, as they say. I talked about that Aeroflot flight that I took with Russian Airlines. It was 2 centimeters too large. I was flying first class. I had elite plus status, the highest status that you can have on the airline. And still, they were telling me, even though it's 2 centimeters too large, they were insisting that I check it. And so I just begged. I said, I have a performance tomorrow at whatever the hall was. I think we were playing Tchaikovsky Hall in Moscow, which is a really known concert space. I said we're playing Tchaikovsky Hall tomorrow. I've got to have my instrument be safe. And I said the last time that I put it under the plane, it caused $1,000 of damage. It was probably a slight exaggeration. I think it was probably more like $850. But the point is, I told the truth, which is that when I was in college a long time ago, I was taking a flight and I boarded too late and I had to put it under the plane and it caused a bunch of damage. And I said it's really delicate. I said it's a vintage instrument. I mean, the fact of the matter is that my Lupafaro was actually not vintage, but you just say all this fluff stuff to really accentuate the fact that you've got to take it on board. And usually they're going to empathize with you eventually, but be polite and respectful. That will usually get you far in life in general. But that's really the last step. And recap, there are these 5 tricks that will help you with your instruments, and traveling with instruments can be stressful at times, but if you keep these tricks in mind, it will really help you with the process. And that's it. Happy touring, guys. Happy traveling, and stay in the shed. Always be practicing, as I always say. And we'll see you next time.